In Catch-22, Joseph Heller drops a tight bomb pattern of satire on the justification of war, inept bureaucracy, the capricious military-industrial complex, and soulless free market capitalism to boot. Set in the twilight of the Second World War, Catch-22 follows Captain John Yossarian, a United States Army Air Corps bombardier stationed with his squadron on the island of Pianosa off the coast of Italy. The book follows the shenanigans and exploits of Yossarian and his fellow airmen as they fly bombing missions on the European mainland, dodging flak not just from German gunners, but from their own bumbling superior officers too. Here, Heller pulls together a non-linear narrative thread, jumping around in time, tying knots of absurd hysterical events between almost 70 characters with ebullient and paraphrastic prose that may or may not have rubbed off on me a little bit. Right from the gun, Heller hits the reader with a barrage of hilarity. For a novel filled with such ridiculous and frequently stupid people, Heller writes it with wit, throwing quick 1-2 punch jokes and turning clever phrases throughout. However, the comedic exterior of the book conceals something far more sinister beneath the surface, as Yossarian and his friends are increasingly trapped in and traumatized by the life and death war game in which they are merely pawns. The mechanism sprung on them is often the spiraling logic of the titular Catch-22, a term which the novel launched into our popular lexicon.
Catch-22. Anyone who wants to get out of combat duty isn't really crazy. Catch-22 specifies that a concern for one's own safety in the face of danger, real and immediate, is the process of a rational mind.
What?
Orr's crazy, and therefore he can get out of flying combat missions. All he has to do is ask. But as soon as he asks, he's no longer crazy, and so he has to fly more missions.
What?
Orr would be crazy to want to fly more missions and sane if he didn't. But if he's sane, then he has to fly them. If he flies them, then he's crazy, and so he doesn't have to. But if he doesn't want to, then he's sane, and so he has to.
That's some catch, that Catch-22.
It's the best there is.
Truth be told, the more I read Catch-22, the more I felt the net of entrapment this novel casts. I was lured in by the laughs, until I eventually realized what a dark and disturbing story I had wandered into. But even so, Heller presents a potent, if somewhat twisted, ethic of life in Catch-22, particularly through the character of Yossarian. At face value, Yossarian's interest in life writ large is little more than an interest in the preservation of his own life, a disposition that reads either as cowardice, craziness, or sober-minded sanity, depending on who you ask. And yet, at nearly every turn, Yossarian acts in ways that preserve the lives of others, and even his enemies. For example, Yossarian deliberately misses the intended German targets of his bombing missions, and later refuses to get involved in a murder plot against the myopic Colonel Cathcart, the officer most directly responsible for the increasing quantity and danger of his squadron's missions, the one who's hijacking the means for them to actually return back home. Contrast Yossarian with the character who, to me at least, is the most morally vacuous person in the whole novel. That would be Lieutenant Mess Officer Milo Minderbinder, whose only ethical allegiance is to driving up the profits for his multinational black market syndicate. Ultimately, he doesn't care who he helps, hurts, or even kills, whether friend or foe, because as Milo never fails to remind anyone who questions his actions, they all have a share. I can understand why Catch-22 has been cemented as a classic of 20th century American literature, but I can also understand why it took a while for that reputation to actually solidify. The novel received mixed reviews upon its release in 1961, arriving in the fading afterglow of America's World War II global heroics, and just before the escalation of the United States' involvement in the ultimately disastrous Vietnam War. Early critics hawked Heller's novel for its bizarre plotting, for its frequent crassness and uncouth depictions of debauchery. Perhaps, though, Heller was just a bit ahead of his time, with more years and perspective needed for readers and critics to fully recognize Catch-22's pointed satirical portrayal of the, at best, amoral and often outright immoral modern military machine, as a fundamentally dehumanizing engine that obscures the dignity of ordinary people, not just the fighting men, but the often victimized women and children too, in the dense smoke of its polluting exhaust. Reading Catch-22 was like belly laughing through a gut punch, and for that reason, I strongly recommend it.